have 7 books that I want to talk to you about today, which is actually kind of a miracle considering how hectic March was. I feel like I was working so much, and I also had a small vacation, and I also had friends visiting, and then I had more friends visiting, and then I had more friends visiting, and then a party to plan, and then a party to prepare for, and then a party to execute. And on top of that, it was housework and cooking and being a good spouse and being a good friend, and yet somehow I managed to get through 7 books in March, which is incredible for me. I'm usually a 4 book per month kind of reader, so don't they say that the busier you are, the more time you make? They do say that, right? But that's how it feels. It's like I'm trying to squeeze every spare minute out of each day in order to get my books read and hopefully finally this video made. So since there's 7 books, I won't waste any more time because there's a lot to talk about. In March, I read 2 nonfiction books, as usual, about authorship and the writing craft, and 5 fiction books of various genres. I had some hits and I had some misses. And yeah, it's a lot. We'll go through them. So I say that March had highs and lows, but it certainly started out on a high note. I started off with a reread of one of my favorite books, Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House, and I did this for an annotated book exchange with one of my best friends. So she has my copy and this is her copy, and you can see that it is full of all of these little tabs, and then the pages have a bunch of highlights and annotations in the margins. One thing about Shirley Jackson is that she is a real prominent figure in the horror canon, and many contemporary horror authors cite The Haunting of Hill House specifically as a book that they found formative or inspirational for them. I can relate. So this follows the story of Dr. Montague, who wants to be taken seriously as a paranormal researcher and thus puts together a small expedition to document the paranormal activity and phenomena that have been occurring at the eponymous Hill House. His goal is to put together a team of people who have had experience with paranormal events in their lives before, and although he sends out a bunch of letters, only 2 people respond. And those 2 people are Theo, who has some kind of either like psychic or empathetic ability that allows her to almost read people's thoughts, perhaps. And then there's Eleanor, or Nellie, who had an experience with rocks falling from the sky onto her house when she was a child. But aside from that, she lived a fairly sheltered life. She spent many years taking care of her ailing mother, so she didn't really get out much. She didn't have much of a life of her own. And after her mother passed, she's been living at her sister's family home, where she doesn't exactly feel welcome and she doesn't really have much of a life of her own. Then, of course, there's Dr. Montague, and then there's Luke, who's a descendant of the family that owns the house and who will someday inherit Hill House, who has to be present as part of Dr. Montague's contract. The book follows Eleanor as she makes her trip out to the country, to Hill House, meets all of the people who will be staying there, experiences the paranormal events that the house is so famous for, and slowly experiences the crumbling of her psyche. The book touches on themes of grief, family relationships, the supernatural, identity, and childhood or immaturity, as opposed to adulthood and independence. And in terms of trigger warnings, a reader should be prepared to read about mental illness, death or suicide, toxic relationships, especially toxic family relationships and toxic friendships, panic attacks and social anxiety, abandonment and exclusion, and car accidents. There's a lot of mentions of car accidents in this book. The thing about this book is that this is the first novel that I read where I had to kind of stop on several occasions and put the book down and kind of catch my breath and gather myself, center myself in order to try and calm down, because I got so wrapped up in Eleanor's feelings, the fear of exclusion that she has and how that warps her perception of the interactions of other people around her, the way that her psychological state starts to deteriorate throughout the course of the novel, and the implications that that has. And Shirley Jackson is just so good at manipulating the reader's feelings as well, making the reader also experience that feeling of exclusion. In a lot of novels, there's always a sense of dramatic irony where the reader knows what's happening even if the character doesn't. But there's a few places in the book where other characters are having conversations and Eleanor is either coming into the conversation partway through or she's left out of the context somehow. And there's no filling in that gap for the reader in a way that just is very, very unsettling. I feel like I've seen some people talk about this book before on YouTube, and a few of them have said that they did not find this book scary. And I just don't understand that, really. I think this book is very scary. I feel like if you have a social anxiety, you completely understand what is so frightening about this book. Eleanor is so imaginative and so sensitive, but she's also so susceptible, right? She's so open to influence, and the way that she loses control over herself while she's staying in the house just kind of like grips at you and makes you like question how secure you are in your own identity in a way that I find terrifying. I think some of them also found that the language wasn't very accessible to them, or the style of writing didn't feel terribly contemporary, which makes sense because this book was written a long time ago. But I think that there is something so delightful about the use of language, about the references to other literature and songs, and in particular about the quick, witty, delightful banter and conversation that the characters have in dialogue. I wish people still talked the way that the characters in this book do, because it is absolutely delightful. And the rhythm and movement in their conversations really provides a moment of relief in between all of the terrible stuff that's happening in this book. So yes, in every universe, on every read, Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House gets a 5 stars from me. If you are new to horror, I recommend picking this one up. It is short, it's very easy to read, and it is gripping. If you have read horror before but have not read this book, definitely check it out. It is part of the horror canon for a reason. And if you watched the Netflix adaptation, which is more like an homage than an adaptation, you should absolutely pick this book up because they are very, very different animals. So that's Haunting of Hill House. That was my first read. Then I went on vacation, and that was the perfect time to read this next book, which was James S.A. Corey's Caliban's War, which is the second book of the series The Expanse, which has also been adapted into an Amazon show. And I say it's the perfect time to read it on vacation because look at this thing. That is a chonky boy. It is 595 pages of science fiction, political and military intrigue and mystery and all kinds of good, cool, character-driven stuff too. So I read the first book, Leviathan's Wake, I believe in January, and I have a toxic trait as a reader, which is that I tend to fall off with series because I feel like after a while, characters stop growing or developing in a lot of series in ways that I find interesting. It's like the author doesn't really know what to do with them anymore. But although it's only the second book in the series, it's still doing a great job of treating the characters with the same care that it does in the first book. So Leviathan's Wake features James Holden and his crew as they try to stop Eros, which is a space station, from crashing into Earth and spreading this alien biological weapon which could destroy Earth entirely. And they succeed, but this book deals with the fallout of that. So now the proto-molecule, which is this alien bioweapon thing, is out there and everybody knows about it, and there are bad actors who want to use it and turn it into a weapon because that's what humanity does best, right? We see destructive potential and we figure out a way to make it work for us. James Holden and his crew are on a relief mission when they bump into Prax, who is a biologist whose daughter has gone missing, kidnapped. And he sees James Holden and recognizes him from all of the broadcasts that he was sending out during the first book. So he sees James Holden and thinks to himself, that man was a hero. I can ask him for help and he will help. And of course, James Holden has very good morals, so he does. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to help Prax find his daughter. But that means that he gets caught up in all the other stuff that's going on in this book, which involves the weaponization of the proto-molecule into creating some kind of like hybrid soldier. And that's where we meet the other two POV characters, which are Avasarala, who is a politician from Earth, whose goal is to prevent interplanetary war from breaking out between Earth, Mars, and the asteroid belt. And then there's Bobby, who is a Martian Marine who encounters one of these proto-molecule human weapon creatures at the very beginning of the book in what is a hugely traumatic encounter for her. So all four of these characters end up tangled together trying to figure this out, solve the problem, in what is a very action-packed and exciting 595-page novel. This is a really good book. I enjoyed it quite a lot. I thought this was a great second installment to the series. If you are reading The Expanse, you can expect to see grief, family, or the nature of belonging, the confrontation of fear or not letting fear rule your life, developing relationships, which is nice. I always like a little touch of romance, and the nature of humanity. And because this is a little bit of a mix of sci-fi and horror, there are some trigger warnings to share. We're talking about violence, kidnapping and family separation, war, death, including child death, body horror, child abuse, medical experimentation, graphic injury, propaganda, and then media propaganda against specific individuals in the service of the state. Some heavy themes and some heavy trigger warnings to consider, but fascinating read, very well structured. I thought that this book was a lot more polished than the first book in the series, although I did think Leviathan's Wake had maybe a little bit more heart. 4 stars from me, great book, very enjoyable, went by super quick despite being such a big book. And yeah, I think I would give this a good recommend for people who are interested in character-driven, light on the science fiction. So I finished that book while I was on vacation, which I wasn't expecting to be able to do, but I'm happy that I planned for it because that meant that I did take a second book on the trip with me. And that book was Stephen King's On Writing, a memoir of the craft. I read this book for the first time when I was in high school. It was recommended to me by my English teacher, and I think that was the right time to read this book. I think this is a fantastic book about authorship and the craft for newer writers or people who have not read craft books before. I would say that I didn't find it as compelling or innovative in its thinking as I did the first time, now that I've been doing this for quite a while. So the book is broken down into 3 parts. The first part is a memoir of Stephen King's life, which honestly, even if you're a seasoned writer and you find that the latter half of the book is not as useful for you, just Stephen King's memoir portion is really good and really interesting, and you can absolutely see why he ended up writing horror. He does a great job, and his tone and his writing style are fantastic for memoir. The following 2 sections have to do with writing. The first deals with the author's toolbox, which are the specific skill sets that an author should have at their disposal. And then the third portion is about the philosophy of writing and advice that he has specifically about the craft. Now, for most of my craft books, I don't know if you've noticed before, but I tend to mark them up quite a bit in terms of tabs. This book did not get that much. This is absolutely a pointless aside, but I just need somebody to agree with me. Look at these things. Do these not look like little fingers to you? Or like, not even fingers, but like toes, like foot fingers. These are foot fingers. There are little foot fingers coming out of my book. I do tend to put a lot of tabs into my nonfiction books about writing craft because there's a lot of things that I'd like to flip back to or find again. Not so much with this book because, like I said, I think a lot of the information and the advice that he shares are things that you sort of learn through osmosis over the years and not framed in a way that makes them feel particularly new. In fact, I think this book might even be a little bit dated at this point. A lot of what he says feels a little bit regressive now, where it might not have felt that way when it was published. I'm going to read you this one quote. He says that one of the pieces of feedback that he got when he was a young writer was the following: "Not bad, but puffy. You need to revise for length. Formula: second draft equals first draft minus 10%. Good luck." And I just find that really funny because I feel like this book could be trimmed down by at least 10% more. Stephen King has a wonderful style. It's very fluid, very conversational, very easy to read. He has a very distinct voice. It is a bit of a wordy voice though, and I am a wordy writer. I'm a wordy talker. I love to yap, so I completely get it. But not everything needs to be efficient, obviously. Style is as important as efficiency in writing in my eyes, so I can completely see wanting to keep it for the style. However, I do think there was a lot that went on for quite a while that could have been a fair bit shorter. That's just my opinion. I think this is a great writing book for people, again, who are newer authors or who haven't read about the craft before, and I do recommend reading it, if only just for that first memoir portion. But I can't say that I'm going to be looking at this book as a resource personally in the future, which is why I'm only going to give it 2.5 stars. That said, 2.5 is exactly in the middle on the scale from 0 to 5, so that's not a bad rating. It's just maybe not as high as I would have given it when I read it the first time when I was younger. Okay, try not to kill me for this. So, in my BookTube newbie tag video, I had a little section where I talked about the book that I've been putting off reading for a while that I really need to get to. And someone in the comments was kind enough to encourage me to read it, and so I finally did. This book was Stephen King's Misery. This is a horror novel which follows the story of Paul Sheldon, who's an author, and he writes both literary fiction and what he considers his sellout books that pay the bills, which are historical romances that star a main character named Misery. And he doesn't love those books. He feels chained to them. He feels like he can finally escape them now that he finished and published the final book in the series. And then he writes his great American novel, and he goes out to celebrate, and he's drunk off his ass, and he gets into a car crash, and the person that rescues him from the car crash is Annie Wilkes. And Annie Wilkes is both his biggest fan and has a long history of murder. So she is very dissatisfied with the way that he ended the Misery series, and she is not going to let him go until he writes a new book for her, which ends Misery's story the way that she feels that it needs to end. So she patches him up, she confines him to a room, chains him basically to a typewriter, and he has to write this new book. It follows the story of how that progresses, as well as his attempts to escape, and so on and so forth. So given that this is a horror novel, it tackles themes of survivalism, as well as the nature of art and the artist versus selling out. And there are a handful of trigger warnings to include torture, violence, death, murder, gore, injury, dismemberment, confinement, addiction, suicidal thoughts, drug use, racial slurs, misogyny, rape, mental illness, and animal death. I feel like the story of Misery has been part of the cultural zeitgeist for quite a while. I hadn't read the book, but for years I've been making jokes to my author friends that I'm going to misery them and lock them up in my guest room so that they can just focus on writing and I can read all of their work much faster because I love their work. It's a joke I've made before, and now I can say that I read the book that it came from. And I did for the most part like it. But I will say I had some mixed feelings about it in a couple of different respects. So one of the things that the book does, which is both super interesting and a real trouble spot for me, is that it has these sections where it includes excerpts from the manuscript that Paul is writing. And he's writing this on a typewriter, and the typewriter is missing the letter N. And then it's missing the letter T, and then it's missing the letter E, and then he's handwriting the novel. The problem is that the way that those intercuts are included, you have the courier text, and then you also have these handwritten letters in the place of the letters that have fallen out, which is a really cool metatextual thing to do, but an absolute nightmare for me to read. I was so visually overstimulated by it that I suffered a lot. It took so much effort to get through those pages. And then when he finally starts handwriting the book and you have to decipher his scrawl, oh my God, I couldn't do it. It was just not a pleasant experience for me at all. And not in like a way that makes me feel challenged. Oh yeah, I can see that he's doing this thing and I see how much it sucks and I really identify with the character. No, it didn't go that far for me. It was more like, oh my God, should I just stop reading this book? This is too freaking hard to read. which I know is completely a personal problem, okay? If this was not your experience, I get it, because I don't think this is probably most people's experience. But personally, I had a really hard time with it. The other thing is that Stephen King has, I think, the opposite of what most people's problem is with writing. I think most authors have an issue with what's called like the sagging middle, where they have a strong opening and they know exactly where they want the story to go, but that like middle couple hundred pages of a book, they don't quite know how to handle it, like how to get from point A to point B. That's not the case for Stephen King. The middle of this book is absolutely fantastic, and I loved it. The way that the tension increases in the house between Paul and Annie, it's really, really good. It's just that the beginning drags on for me, and it gets a little bit too wrapped up in itself. I understand what it's doing. He's going through this drug and pain-fueled haze, waking up after his accident, but it just takes a little too long to get to the point for my personal preference. And then the end also has similar issues in my eyes. So although I love the story that this book tells, I had some problems with the way that the story was told. So I don't think that this book was necessarily for me. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it as much as I was hoping to, unfortunately. I just feel like I really need to have a good ending in order to feel satisfied by a book, but this ending felt a little phoned in my opinion. Maybe this was not the right place to start. But I did read it, and I really appreciate that somebody took the time to actually recommend that I do follow through on it. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think Misery gets like a 2-star from me. It makes me sad because, like I said, I really did want to like it. I've also been told that Stephen King's short stories are a lot stronger and that his non-horror fiction tends to be better structured. So I might kind of veer out of horror for him for a while and try the short stories next. But I think it's going to be a little while. I think 2 books in a row by him was enough to last me for a little while. So we'll get to the short stories maybe sometime later on this year. So if my critique about Stephen King's writing in general is that he's a little bit wordy, I think my critique for this next author would be that maybe she's a little bit puffy. So this is Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg. This is a nonfiction book about authorship and the writing craft, and Natalie Goldberg approaches it from the perspective of Zen practice. She views writing as something that you should be doing habitually, that it is a skill that you can hone, something that you can get better at over time, and cultivate the way that you would cultivate, for example, a meditative practice. From what I understand, that perspective was pretty novel for when this book was published in the 80s. I think even in On Writing, Stephen King has a very sort of limiting perspective about what it means to be a writer. He feels that if you're a bad writer, you can become a competent writer, but you're not going to become a good writer. And if you're a competent writer, you might become a good writer, but you're not going to become a great writer. So he feels that talent is the key to becoming a brilliant writer. I don't feel that way, and I don't think Natalie Goldberg does. I define talent as the ability to learn a skill quickly or the ability to take to a skill naturally, but not necessarily as the thing that decides where the cap of your skill is going to be. If someone approaches something with intention and practice and dedication, they can become brilliant over time. So while I think the message that she has is good, Natalie Goldberg does strike me as the kind of person who, if she were a yoga teacher, would say things like, "Feel your face melt into your face." Just like puffy, beautiful nonsense like that. She does have some interesting concepts in here. For example, she talks about composting, which is this idea that like the mind cannot take an experience or a piece of information and immediately translate it into something that is effective in writing without first composting it, which allows it to sift through the subconscious and create all these interwebs with other ideas in your brain and then mature into the fertile ground that you can actually plant a seed or an idea in. This is a kind of puffy analogy that she has a lot in the book. It's very woo-woo, very new age. Not my personal preference, but that said, I do agree with a lot of the things that she's saying, even if I'm kind of rolling my eyes at the way that she says them. Even if she didn't tell you, you would know that she is a poet. She does have some very beautiful language in here, and I do think it's a good book worth reading if you haven't read it before, but maybe it won't be my favorite craft book. I'm going to give this one about 3 stars just because there are some interesting new ways of conceiving writing, but I don't think that this is going to change my internal conceptions of how writing should be or how someone should approach it as a craft. So this was not the most successful month for craft books, given that I wouldn't give either of them a hard recommend, but I am happy that I read them both. So if Writing Down the Bones was very literary and very puffy, so too was the next book. This was Creatures by Chrissy Van Meter, which, let's just take a moment to appreciate the beauty of this cover. Like, that's gorgeous. That looks stunning. So this is a literary fiction novel which tells the story of Evie, who grew up on this island off the coast of California with her father and her mother sometimes. She was a bit of an absentee mom. And her dad, although he tried to provide for her, didn't always have stable housing for them. He grew and sold drugs for a living. Not necessarily the most role model-y parent one would want. And it follows the story of Evie's life in a non-linear narrative throughout her childhood, before she gets married, and then 10 or so years into her marriage. So given all that, this book touches on themes of grief, forgiveness, what it means to love, and honesty. And it touches on more difficult topics like drug use, abandonment, alcoholism, adult and minor relationships, underage sex, underage substance use, addiction, parental death, and infidelity. And I think those are all really interesting, themes and topics. And in theory, I should have really liked this book. However, I did not like this book. I hated this book. I hated this book, okay? I really, really did not like this book. But let's be fair. Preferences are preferences. That does not mean that you might not like this book. So, things that this book does well. The language is absolutely beautiful. She has some very lyrical sentences, beautiful imagery, beautiful sense of rhythm, really nicely done in that respect from the line level. She also explores some really interesting storytelling through parallel. So Evie is a marine biologist, I believe, and so she has these intercuts or insets where she talks about marine life and ecosystem and ecological collapse, which are very nicely contrasted and paralleled to her emotional states and her own relationships as they are deteriorating over time, which is really well done. And those are the things that I was able to enjoy. I think that's the end of my enjoyment. There's 3 things that I can talk about that I did not like. The first of which is the point of view. It's written in the first person, and first person is supposed to feel intimate. It's supposed to feel like you have insight into the main character and you really understand them and you're really invested in them. But what this first person perspective felt like was like you're sitting across the table from an elderly relative that you don't know very well, and they're just kind of like telling you their life story, not always in order, and they just don't stop talking, and you are desperate to get away, but you don't want to interrupt them. And they just don't stop talking. That's what it feels like to me. As a character, Evie is so self-involved that it's just exhausting and boring. And I didn't feel connected to her at all. I felt like there is no way that a person can live while being so obsessed with themselves to this extent. It was not my cup of tea. A lot of her anxieties are very relatable. She has issues with being able to express herself to the people that she loves, with being able to be honest about her feelings and her desires for fear of the repetition of this cycle of promise and broken promise that she experienced throughout her youth. But I think that there are more elegant ways that that story could have been told than it was in this book. The second thing I didn't like about it was the non-linear narrative. I love non-linear storytelling. It's not usually an issue for me. The problem was that this book starts out with this metaphor. So at the beginning of the book, she's getting ready for her wedding, but her husband is out at sea and hasn't come back from his fishing expedition yet. And there's a dead whale that floats into the bay and it's not able to go back out again. And it's like sitting there and rotting. So there's this metaphor that they set out at the beginning of the novel But then by the time that we get to the end of the novel, the metaphor doesn't matter anymore because we already know from earlier in the story what happens 10 years after the story ends. So you don't really care about the resolution of that piece of the story because you already know that 10 years down the line, this doesn't really matter because she goes on to have these problems later on. It just doesn't work for me in that respect. And then the last hang up that I had about this book is about the kind of literary that it is. So I know that a lot of writers of literary sort of scoff at genre because books that are genre fiction are very tidy, they're very squared away, everything gets wrapped up neatly, and it's not a very good reflection of what life is actually like, right? Because in life, we have questions that are unanswered, or we have things that are not satisfying, or stuff that happens that's out of our control, right? It's not all this neat package of story that most fiction novels are. And I understand that a lot of literary writers are sort of trying to get away from that and write something that feels more true to life and has more use of technique and explores, the beauty of language in a way that you don't often find with, genre fiction, which is fine. That's not a problem, right? It's just that for me, I feel like it's a waste of time. If I get to the end of a novel and I think to myself, nothing happened, the character didn't change, why did I read this? Then it's not a good book for me. And there are lots of literary novels that don't do the genre things and yet still feel satisfying from a story perspective or from a reader perspective. And this book just did not do that for me. And I know that preference is everything when it comes to this kind of thing. For every book that I absolutely love, there is somebody out there who hates it passionately, and vice versa. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't read this book. I'm just saying that I personally found it to be a huge waste of time, aside from the fact that the language in here is very beautiful. I do think Chrissie Van Meter has an excellent command of the language, and she really does some beautiful things with it. I just personally felt like the way that this was written and the story that it told didn't move me, really. I identified with the character at many points. Like I said, a lot of her struggles are very true to life and very relatable. But nothing happened with them in a way that made me feel strongly enough about her that I could say that I actually cared about her as a character. You know what I mean? Yeah, so that's Chrissie Van Meter's Creatures. Not my favorite book. 1 star. Hated it. Doesn't mean that you will. So read the synopsis, read some positive reviews and see if that inspires you to pick it up, because I'm not going to be able to inspire you to pick it up. Unless you're the kind of person who likes to read things other people hate. In which case, have at it. I hated this book. Okay. And I honestly thought that I was going to end March on that nice low note. However, at the last moment, everything turned around. So I finished Creatures on March 30th. On March 31st, I started reading my next book, and I actually could not put it down. I mean, I had to while I was working, but before work and after work and all the way into the evening, I could not stop reading it, and I managed to finish it in one day. So this is the Travelling Cat Chronicles by Hiro Arikawa, and it is translated by Philip Gabriel. And this is a Japanese cozy fiction, and you can tell that it's cozy fiction because there is a cat on a cover, and cats on the cover is how Japanese publishers will signpost cozy fiction. So, very cozy book. I read it. It was raining outside. I was wrapped up in my blankets. Very cozy, very comfortable, very good read. It tells the story of Nana, the cat, who was a stray until he gets adopted by a young man named Satoru, and they live together for several years until, because of some unforeseen circumstances, Satoru has to give up Nana. He can no longer take care of him. So he sets out to visit some friends in different parts of the country, trying to find the right place for Nana to go so that he will still have a family to look after him. So this book touches on themes regarding the nature of love, belonging, and loyalty, familial responsibility, and friendship. And it does have some trigger warnings, and I will warn that some of these are spoilers, so just skip ahead if you need to. It talks about death, animal death, parental death, car accidents, terminal illness, specifically cancer, abandonment, child abuse, and infertility. But that said, all of those subjects are treated with such warmth and such gentleness that, you just can't help but love this story. Up until about the halfway point of this book, I thought that this was going to be a very lovely and very heartwarming and pretty forgettable story. And then by the time that I got to the end, I was weeping. I was so emotionally invested and so moved. And I'm like getting a little choked up just thinking about it. But like, it's such a beautiful ending. It's really, oh, jeez. Oh. It has a beautiful, beautiful ending. It's really stunning. The development of the characters and the way that they interact and the way that they care for each other is really beautiful. It was the right book at the right time. Given that I've only just finished reading this book, I am getting very emotional just talking about it, but I wouldn't be prepared to give it a 5-star rating just yet. I think if I were to read this book a little further down the line and find myself as invested and as moved as I was the first time, then I would give it 5 stars, but for the moment, it's going to get a solid 4. I really, really loved this book. I'm not sure if it's because of the timing of when I read it or if it's because of the actual effect of the story. So I want to give it a little more time to marinate on that front. That said, The Travelling Cat Chronicles is an excellent book if you want something that is heartwarming and gentle, or if you need a change of pace after reading a few books that you didn't enjoy, then this is a great palate cleanser to turn things around with. It's very easy to read. You can read it in one afternoon the way that I did. It goes very quickly, and the language is very accessible, and the translation is really well done to the point that you really do get immersed in the story and sort of forget that it's a translation for the most part. Travelling Cat Chronicles, 4 stars, hard recommend. Put it on your TBR. Someday you're going to want to read this book. So I started the month on a high and I ended on a high. Hills and valleys, hills and valleys. That wraps us up for today. I will be back sometime with another video. I think the next video that I have planned has to do with writing. It'll probably be the next installment in my series about iterating the writing process. So you can look forward to that at some point. Again, I'm not making promises anymore. I've learned my lesson. When my friend was here and she was sitting on the couch while I was filming my first try for this video, she was like, "Don't you have a signature sign off by now?" And I was like, "No, that would require forethought." Not my strong suit. So yeah, I don't know that I'm the kind of person who can pull off a sign out with any degree of elegance. So for the meantime, just do the YouTube things, like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what books you loved and what books you didn't love in March, what you're looking forward to reading in April, what books you think I should try or steer clear from. I really, really just want to talk about books with you guys. So yeah, comment button's down there, click on it, type some words, and then hit enter, and then we can have a conversation. So yeah, thank you so much for spending time with me today. You take care, okay? We'll be back soon. Bye.